There's been widespread fury over the decision to hand a community payback order to 21-year-old Sean Hogg, who raped a 13-year-old schoolgirl when he was 17. The judge at Glasgow High Court said that if Hogg was over 25, he would have received a jail sentence of 4 or 5 years. Instead, he was given 270 hours of unpaid work. The ruling has fuelled calls for an urgent review of the sentencing guidelines for under 25s, which prioritise rehabilitation rather than punishment. Today, the First Minister, Humza, Yousaf, reacted to the public controversy.
Look, I have to be really careful as the First Minister of Scotland. Of course, I shouldn't, and no minister should ever intervene in sentencing decisions. They are rightly for the independent judiciary. But I heard remarks from Rape Crisis Scotland, from many others too, saying that they are astonished at the sentence. And let me be clear, I can understand the strength of feeling. It's really important I don't say any more, because my understanding is that the Crown is considering a potential appeal to that sentence from the press reports that I've seen. So I can understand where people's concern is, but it's really important also that I don't and I'm not seen to interfere in the independence of the judiciary.
We discussed some of the issues around the sentencing of Sean Hogg with the criminal defence advocate, Edith Forrest, and the Scottish Conservatives Justice spokesperson, Jamie Greene. Jamie, you've said it's outrageous and appalling that this crime wasn't punished by a prison sentence. What sentence would you like to have seen?
Well, first of all, I think all our thoughts and wishes today should go to the victim of this horrific crime. Obviously, it's had a lot of media coverage today, and I know this is quite a traumatic experience for the victim and her family. So I want to put that on the record, first of all. But I think it's not just me. I think many voices over the last 24 hours have expressed outrage and quite a lot of fury over this sentence. The idea that someone who could commit such a horrific crime on a child, to be quite honest with you, can walk out of court with a community sentence, have left some people not just scratching their heads at the relevance and appropriateness of that, but actually downright furious about that decision.
Edith, as you can tell from Jamie, there is a lot of anger and controversy about this sentence. Can you understand where the judge was coming from when he came up with this sentence?
Yes, I can. And certainly, as at January of last year, new sentencing guidelines were issued by the Scottish Sentencing Council to deal with young offenders, just like this young man, with a focus on rehabilitation of offenders for not only the benefit of society, but also to set these men back on a path which they may have come off, but need to be set on in order that society itself is protected. Throwing young people into prison can result in a life of criminality. So I understand that there are high emotions. It's a very serious crime he's been convicted of, but the considerations in sentencing go towards not only ensuring that he doesn't offend again, but just generally protecting society.
Jamie, what's your response to that? The idea that rehabilitation stops cycles of crime, protects society in the long run?
Of course, there is a place for rehabilitation in the criminal justice system. That should happen both outside and inside of prison and young offenders institutions. I think what the outrage that you've heard today is all about is the idea that someone could commit such a serious and grievous act of sexual assault on a young female teenager and walk away from court with a community sentence. And I think that's what's left people outraged by this. There is, of course, an academic, philosophical conversation to be had about rehabilitation and its place. But what we're talking about here is the crime of rape. And I think there are some serious questions to be answered as to whether a community sentence is ever an appropriate outcome for a crime as serious as that. What we've also heard today from victims' organisations, I think, is a very wise point, and that's the sort of message it sends off to young men who may go out and commit such crimes, that they know that they could get away with it effectively. And I think that's a very dangerous message to send the perpetrators of these types of offences. We must be absolutely clear that violence and sexual violence against children is absolutely wrong in our society. And any justice system that says otherwise needs to really think carefully about what it's trying to achieve.
Edith, what's your response to that?
I think the notion that he's walked away almost scot-free is not correct. And this is not the first sentence I've seen for someone convicted of rape, a young offender who has not received a custodial sentence. I had such a case previously, and I consider the judge in that case to be extremely brave in setting that sentence, because the easy option would be just to lock that person up for 5 years. And the reality is, in prison, the access to rehabilitation courses is minimal, and people rarely get onto these courses, so that when they're coming out very much the same, or sometimes worse off because they've learned things in prison. In terms of the sentencing guidelines, and just to plug my own, I interviewed Lady Dorian, who was instrumental in these guidelines. So anyone wanted to watch that can see that on my He Legal YouTube channel. But certainly the purpose of sentencing includes things like protection of the public, punishment, rehabilitation of offenders, and giving the offender the opportunity to make amends, and also to express disapproval of that offending behaviour. But the actual community-based disposal, and I don't know the details in this particular case, but in the case I dealt with, it was a very onerous community-based disposal where the young man had he had to do unpaid work, he had a restriction of liberty order, he had to undergo various courses with social work, and he also had to return to court on a 6-monthly basis so that the court could ensure that he was adhering to these orders. And if there was any slip up or any question over him abiding by what had been imposed upon him, the court took a very dim view of that. So it's not an easy option. It is emotive because people see it as being the person getting off scot-free, but the reality is it's not, and it sets them on a path that would hopefully, as I said at the start, benefit society as a whole.
But Edith, what about the idea that these separate guidelines for under 25-year-olds, and to some people 24, 25 years old is grown up, they're responsible for their actions?
Well, the guidelines weren't just plucked out of some notion. There was a lot of research went into it, a lot of input from other professional psychologists, and that showed that young people, or concluded that young people have perhaps sometimes less culpability just because of their immaturity, their stages. But in sentencing, the guidelines also allow judges to take account of personal circumstances, so trauma or addictions. And again, in the present case, I think I read that there was some element of that as well. So it does account for the immaturity of young people's character, personality, various options. And it does distinguish between sentencing of someone under 25 as opposed to an adult.
Jamie, what do you want to see happen then?
Well, first of all, I hear what Edith was saying, and I appreciate these are academic conversations, but I think the culpability issue is a really important one. A 24-year-old male that sexually assaults a child, for example, is culpable, is absolutely responsible for their own actions, and I don't see how the justice system could treat it any differently. That's why people are really confused about these new guidelines, the idea that a 24-year-old and a 25-year-old should be treated differently. They are adults, and therefore need to pay the price for those horrendous and horrific life-changing crimes that they've committed, particularly against young girls. So that's what needs to change. Politicians need to start listening to the mood of the public on this one, and they're not reading the room properly at the moment. I think the problem is they're listening to academic studies, not listening to victims of crime.
Jamie, are you suggesting these guidelines should be scrapped?
I think they should be revised. I think I've written to the Justice Secretary today, the new Justice Secretary, and I think she has an opportunity here to make a point and actually say that these types of horrific crimes against women and girls are simply not on. Yeah, and I hope that's something we'll be in agreement with. I would like to see a root and branch review of these new sentencing guidelines. I did warn before they were introduced that this might happen, and it has happened. And I was told at the time I was fear-mongering and scaremongering, but it's simply not true. Judges are seeing that their hands are tied increasingly too often by Scottish ministers on these issues. So I would like them to review. I think there needs to be exceptions for very serious, horrendous crimes such as this.
A very brief last word to you, Edith. Some feel that young offenders' rights are taking precedence over rape victims' rights to have justice. Many people feel that justice hasn't been done.
I wouldn't agree with that. I understand the emotion that surrounds cases like this, but as somebody who practices in the High Court of Justiciary, week in and week out, and I see these type of cases, and they very much turn in their own circumstances. We have a society in which young people are encouraged to engage in very adult behaviours, and the consequences of that for the young men that are convicted is huge. And in this particular case, this young guy's on sex offenders register. He's got a community-based disposal. He's not been let off scot-free. There are things in place that are hoping to set him on a track to avoid him repeating this behaviour and to protect society as a whole.
OK, Edith and Jamie, thank you very much indeed for joining us this evening.